Welcome back to Mr. Hunter's book reading. This is The People of Sparks, Chapter 7, A Day of New People. The next day, back in the plaza, Ben Barlow organized the residents of the Pioneer Hotel into teams. The teams would work together and eat lunch together. Each team would be led by someone from Sparks, who would decide where the team's labor was most needed each day. Some days a team might work with the people of Sparks at the bakery, or the shoe workshop, or the wagon yard. Other days they might do a job on their own, such as repairing a fence or digging a ditch. Sooner or later, nearly everyone would have done nearly every kind of work. This was the best way for them to learn, Ben said. Dune's team included his father, 2 teachers from the Ember School, Miss Thorne and Mrs. Polster, Clary Lane, the greenhouse manager, and Edward Pocket, the librarian, who would join them for lunch, but not work with them because he was so old. Dune found Lena in the crowd, the first time he'd seen her since they arrived. He told her about the Pioneer Hotel, and she told him about the doctor's house and what she'd learned from Torrin about the disaster. Lena and Mrs. Murdo were told they'd be a team of 2 with the job of helping Dr. Hester since they were staying at her house. They were sent home, and all the other work teams went off to their first project, digging the hotel toilets. They went out into the scrubby woods behind the Pioneer. The work leaders had brought picks and shovels from town, and they gave each person a tool. "You'll dig 50 holes," one of the leaders said, "each one 6 feet deep. Then you'll build a shelter of scrap lumber around each one." But the people of Ember had never done much digging or picking. They had to be shown how to put a foot on the shovel's edge to drive it into the dirt, and how to lift the pick over the shoulders and bring it down hard. At first they scraped and hacked awkwardly at the hard, dry earth, grunting with effort, dislodging only a few crumbs of dirt with each stroke. After 10 minutes of hard work, they'd made hardly more than shallow dips in the dirt. They were breathing fast. "Did you say 6 feet deep?" someone called out. "That's right," came the answer. So the Emberites set themselves to the task, which was for most of them the hardest work they had ever done. After an hour, Dune had blisters on both hands and a kink in his neck. Some of the others had given up entirely and had flopped down onto the ground, dripping with sweat and aching in every muscle. Dune made himself keep going, but he was glad when the work finally stopped at noon and the team leaders marched them back into town. He heard people murmuring to each other as they walked, "Do you think we'll have to work like this every day?" "It will make us strong, I guess. Or kill us." Each team was assigned to a different household for lunch. Dune's team went to the Parton family. Through the streets of the village, they followed a stout, cheerful woman named Martha Parton, whose wide rear end wagged from side to side as she walked. "Here we are," she said after a few minutes. She opened an unpainted wooden door and ushered the 6 guests inside. "Welcome to our home," she said. Dune looked around the low-ceilinged room. At one end was a long wooden table. At the other, a couple of benches stood before a niche in the smoke-stained wall. Sitting on the benches were 2 people, who got up and came forward as Martha introduced them. "My husband, Ordney," Martha said. He was tall and narrow, and with a mustache like a brown toothbrush under his nose. "And my son, Kensington." Kensington was a little younger than Dune. Skinny boy with yellow hair, big ears, and freckled nose. He kept his eyes to the floor, except for a couple of quick, curious glances. "Hi," he said to the floor in one soft, shy voice. "And these," Martha Parton said to her family, sweeping her arm in the direction of the guests, "are the people from underground." She raised her eyebrows at them. "You're lucky to have found your way here," she said. "The only other settlements we know of are little miserable ones hundreds of miles away. Everything else is just hard, rocky dirt and ruins and grass." "And you've not only come to the right place," added Ordney. "You've come at the right time. It's taken years of hard work, but Sparks is finally doing well." "Now," Martha said, clapping her hands, "time to eat." They sat down at the big table, and Martha brought out dishes of food. "I suppose you've never tasted anything like this," she said, handing around a bowl of fresh peas. "Just picked them this morning. And this is pumpkin bread, made from what I canned last year's crop." good, isn't it? Did you have pumpkin bread where you came from?" "No, indeed," said Dune's father. "We did have peas, though," said Clary, "grown in our greenhouses." "And very fine they were," said Mrs. Polster loyally, "though slightly smaller than these." "Probably you haven't had picked carrots either," Martha said, passing the dish around. "These are from my mother's famous recipe." "Oh, we did have carrots," said Mrs. Polster. "A nice pale orange, some of them fully 4 inches long." "Is that right?" said Martha. "Ours are 12 inches usually." Miss Thorne picked delicately at her food, making a polite comment now and then. Edward Pocket ate with such a vigorous appetite that he had no time for talking. Kensington ate steadily and silently. Every time Dune glanced his way, he found the boy staring at him. But as soon as their eyes met, Kensington looked back at his plate. Ordney Parton cleared his throat. Apparently this meant he was going to speak, because his family all instantly looked at him. "I never knew," he said, "that there was a kind of people who lived underground. Must feel strange to you here on the surface." "Actually," said Dune, "we aren't a different kind of people. This place feels familiar, in a way, because we came from here originally." "From here?" "Oh, I don't think so," said Martha. "You don't look a bit like us. You're so much, well, smaller. You'll pardon my saying so, and paler." "True," said Clary, "but I suppose that's because of living in a dark place for so long. Everything is bigger and brighter here." "But why do you think you came from here?" Martha asked. "Because of a notebook we found," Dune said. "It was written by someone from this world who went to live in Ember right at the beginning. All the people of Ember came from this world." "Is that so?" said Martha, eyeing Dune skeptically. "Well, I must say, it's the strangest thing I've ever heard." Dune's father changed the subject. "You have such a fine, solid house," he said. "What is it made of?" "Earth," said Martha. "Pounded," said Ordney. "Strong as stone." "Thick walls," said Martha. "They make it cool in hot weather and warm in cold." She reached for another pickled carrot. "I suppose you lived in, some sort of burrows?" "Stone houses," said Edward Pocket, suddenly joining the conversation because his plate was empty. "2 stories, extremely sturdy, never too warm." There was a silence. "Such a lovely lunch," said Miss Thorne in a small voice. "Perfectly delicious," said Mrs. Polster declared. The others chimed in, and Martha beamed. They all rose from the table, and Martha scurried into the kitchen and came out with a basket full of cloth-wrapped parcels. She handed one to each of her guests. "Your supper," she said, "and breakfast." "Thank you," said Dune's father. "You're very generous." They filed out the front door, and Dune was the last to leave. Just as she stepped outside, he felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Kensington standing behind him, his eyes wide. "Aren't you the one who found the way out?" he whispered. Dune nodded. "I thought so," the boy said. He made a curious gesture, stuck out his hand with his fingers curled and his thumb straight up. Dune didn't understand it, but he thought it must mean something good, because a shy smile went with it. "Call me Kenny," the boy said, and he darted back through the door. Dune followed his father and others down the street. "He's heard of me," he thought. He felt a pleasant sort of glow. Of course, Kenny was just a boy. It was natural for a young boy to admire an older one. After all afternoon, they worked on the toilet holes, and Dune was ready to drop by the end of the day. When the work leaders let them go, he walked down the long slope of ground in front of the Pioneer Hotel to the river. Large stones bordered the wall at this point. He found one that was flat on top and sank onto it, tired to his bones. The sun was setting. The western sky glowed pink, and the trees on the other side of the river cast long, thin shadows across the ground. He sat for 10 minutes or so, just gazing. His thoughts were swirling slowly. It was going to take the people of Ember, all 400 of them, several days just to build their outhouses, and already they were exhausted. How long before they got used to doing this kind of work? Dune couldn't imagine, feeling so tired day after day. He had blisters on his hands, his wrists and shoulders ached, and his back of his neck felt hot and sore, as if it had been burned. And he was strong and young. What about the older people and the younger children? Of course they'd all have to work if they expected to be fed, but... His thoughts were interrupted by footsteps crunching behind him. He turned. There was Tick Hassler, walking toward him across the field. Dune's pulse quickened a little. Tick moved through the grass with a long stride, and when he came to the rocks alongside the river, he stepped from one to the next easily, never slipping or losing his balance. He raised a hand in greeting, and Dune waved back. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Tick said, coming up beside Dune and smiling down at him. "Not really," said Dune. "Just watching things." "Ah," said Tick. He put his hands on his hips and gazed out across the river. The setting sun shone on his face, making it glow, and draped his long shadow over the rocks. Dune wished he would sit down and talk. After a while, Tick said, "I'll tell you something." Dune glanced up quickly. Tick's eyes were a blue so light it almost was startling. "This is a very fine place you've brought us to," Tick said. "Oh, yes," said Dune, pleased at being given the credit. "You deserve a lot of respect," Tick said. "You may be just a kid, but you took action when things got desperate. You were brave." Ordinarily, Dune didn't pay much attention to what other people thought about him, but there was something about Tick that made it pleasing to have his good opinion. Somehow he didn't even feel insulted at being called just a kid. "Thank you," he said. He thought surely Tick would sit down on the rock next to him now, and they would talk, but instead he stepped onto another rock closer to the water so that he had his back to Dune. They both gazed for a while at the reddening sky. Then Tick turned around and said, "Really a wonderful place. Just look at all this." He swept his arms in a wide arc, taking in the groves of trees, the fields, the river, and the glowing red ball of the sun. "Yes," said Dune, "it is wonderful." "We just need to get ourselves a little more comfortable," Tick said. "I have ideas already. We could fix up this old building first of all, get people organized and working together, get new glass for the windows maybe, pipe some water in from the river. What do you think?" "Sure," said Dune. "Chet Nome wants to work with me," Tick said. "Lizzie Biscoe too, and Allie Bright. How about you?" Sure," said Dune again, a little disappointed that Tick had talked to all these people before him. "You'll be great on the pipe project," Tick said, "because of your experience." Dune nodded. Actually, there were lots of things I'd rather do than work with pipes again, as he had in the Ember Pipe Works. But it might actually be fun to work on a plumbing project with Tick. Energy blazed from Tick's keen blue eyes. "There's so much we can do," said Tick, and Dune waited to hear the end of his sentence, to hear what else he thought they could do, but Tick didn't say any more. He just bent down, plucked a stone from between the bigger rocks, turned back to face the river again, and threw the stone with all his might. It sailed high up, a black dot against the scarlet sky, and came down with a splash in the shallow water on the far side of the river. He then twisted around and smiled at Dune, an exuberant, radiant smile. "See you," he said, and he stepped across the rocks, climbed up the riverbank, and went back toward the hotel. When he was gone, Dune picked up a stone and flung it as hard as he could. It plunked down in the middle of the river. Not a bad throw, but not as good as Tick's. That's the end of the chapter.